liquidity, a sense in the investment community of the strength of the US economy. I think it's a similar sort of trend that you get towards the end of the cycle. I suspect that cycle has ended and that we're going to go into 6 to 9 months of falling equity and commodity markets. I think that when the revised employment data comes out, people are going to be shocked that actually employment fell last year. When you look at retail sales in nominal numbers last year, up to the first 11 months, they rose by 2.4%. But what did CPI do? Rose by 3%. So even taking CPI, then you had negative retail sales last year. Problem is that CPI is manipulated. You talk to any household, the wife who does the weekly or the monthly shopping will tell you inflation is very much higher than that. If you use unmanipulated data, going back to the 1970s, that John Williams of Shadow Government Stats does, inflation this year so far has averaged 10.8%. I mean, even saying that the figure is 5%, then that's a pretty big drop on retail sales. And we'll probably see retail sales in the early months of next year being revised down. So there are all sorts of complications to the economic data. There is two other matters that we need to address. The first is that the revisions in the employment data will be produced by the BLS in February, and that is bound to show a very sharp revision downwards. And since the Philly Fed does a regular assessment of the employment data, not so long ago, they came out with a revised figure for the year ending March this year. And when the BLS revised their data, it was absolutely smack on, 800,000 down. They are now saying for the second quarter that employment fell, whereas the BLS is saying rose by 1.1%. So the economic chips that we will see in the first 6 to 9 months of next year are not going to be good. But there is another element, which is that there's going to be a deliberate policy by the Trump government to take a lot of the fat out of the economy in order to have a sounder base from which they can grow the economy and grow prosperity. For instance, Elon Musk on the 29th of October said, "We have to reduce spending to live within our means, and that necessarily involves some temporary hardship, but will ensure long-term prosperity." So we've got to have a solid base before we can produce the better things for everybody. So on our cycle work, we will see a weak global economy in the first 6 to 9 months of next year. By when the fiscal and monetary stimuli, which Trump and others will introduce, will start a 2-year boom in equities, in business activity, in commodity markets. But the problem is that it will be accompanied by rising inflation. And what we see as we go through 2027 and into 2028, we will see a repeat of the inflation process that we experienced in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And what does that imply? If US CPI is around 13% and global inflation around 15%, what are long-term bonds going to yield? US 10-year treasuries will be yielding over 10%. What is that going to do to a highly leveraged debt system? It's going to be the end of this particular cycle, and we go into rolling recessions or even depression. So how does frictions or the wars being seen in Europe and the Middle East, how do they fit into the scenario? It's very possible that the Trump administration, who don't want wars, will do what they can to prevent wars from escalating. What changed was the hawkish tone that Powell introduced in his Q&A session. And it started, the markets have been overbought, overvalued. It only needed a small trigger, and that was the trigger. And I think this is what will come from that trigger will be over the 6 to 9 months. You'll see, for instance, the S&P falling by about 20%, the FANGs by about 40%, and that then lays the foundations for the next big move up, which will take us into 2027. And then we see the collapse. What we have seen has only been the low-hanging fruit that have gone into failures or bankruptcies. For the bigger fruit, it takes longer to fail because they have other funding options. It's only when those funding options are exhausted do they fail. Maybe that's what he's seeing in the undergrowth of the financial system. I think he's become more realistic. There is a new administration coming in. He's expressed a lot of measures he's going to introduce, and tariffs. Tariffs do two things. They're inflationary, and at the same time, because they're inflationary, they take money away out of the pockets of the average household. It's a very confusing picture, hence why I quoted Elon Musk, who obviously has a big influence on policy. Why I quoted him? Because they understand we can only grow prosperity by taking a lot of the silly stuff out of the system first. So that's why first 9 months next year are going to be tough. Markets falling, economic weakness. Europe is not in a good place. Japan is hardly in a good place. China is actually in a better place, but their recovery won't start until the second half of the year. Quite clearly, Trump wants a ceasefire. By the end of January, Russia will have good control over Ukraine. This morning, they launched a massive attack on Kiev, focusing on command and control bunkers, in which there were also probably NATO officers. The early indications I've only just seen on RT News is they were completely demolished. They have demolished more than 2/3 of Ukraine's power distribution and generating capacity. So it's going to be a very cold winter. Putin has said at his Q&A session yesterday that he wants peace, but peace on his terms. And I think this is going to be a big sticking point because his biggest fear is security of Russia. And that will be the real difficult issue in negotiating with Washington. Because in a couple of years' time, America will have gained hypersonic technology or the equivalent. And therefore, drawing a boundary along the Dnieper River is not going to give Russia's radar systems enough warning. He needs control over the whole of Ukraine so that he has enough warning of any impending missile attack by the West. Moreover, no matter who is in the White House, he is completely distrustful of any piece of paper that is written by NATO/Washington. He does not want any NATO troops patrolling Ukraine. My conclusion is, yes, we get a quick ceasefire, but the negotiations over Ukraine are going to be very protracted. And it's not just going to be Ukraine itself. As Putin says, it's Ukraine's position in Eurasia. So he's looking at a much bigger picture than Ukraine itself. I think there's something else one needs to think of carefully. And that is that the powers behind the throne in Washington are desperate to see that their decades-long objectives of dismembering Russia to gain control of its natural resources can be thrown asunder by Trump. So they are going to do anything they can to see that by the time Trump gets into the White House, he has a big war on his hands. So I throw that out because it's not going to be an easy way from one government to another government in relation to foreign policy.